There always seems to be an argument of whether NFL teams actually tank games or not. In a league so driven by quarterback play, you'd have to think there are some motivated owners out there to get the highest pick possible at the end of a lost season, especially in rich quarterback classes. We've seen examples of it from this season alone in Week 18. The Patriots sitting starters after one drive to try and preserve the first overall pick, to which Joe Milton said not so fast. The Titans rotating quarterbacks and playing their best players a suspiciously low amount of snaps, and the same can be said for the New York Giants. But what about the time a team blatantly tanked the final game of the season in order to guarantee the #1 overall pick? Now, the early 2010s was a rough time for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They had their one outlier season in 2010, going 10-6 with Josh Freeman, but they did fail to make the playoffs that year. It had actually been since 2002 when they won the Super Bowl since their last playoff win. But since their last playoff appearance in 2007, the Bucs had finished 3rd or 4th in their division for the past 7 seasons from 2008 to 2014. The once promising Josh Freeman flamed out, the head coaching spot was a disaster since John Gruden was fired, and it's not like they were impressive on either side of the ball. The Greg Schiano era had its promising moments, but eventually he wore out the players and got on their nerves, and after a 4-12 season in year 2, he was let go as well. 2014 saw some wholesale changes for the Bucs, hiring a new head coach and a new GM in that same offseason. For head coach, they hired Lovie Smith, who was most known for his success with the Chicago Bears and making the Super Bowl in 2006. For general manager, they brought in Jason Licht from the Cardinals organization, and he's actually still with Tampa till this day 11 years later. It's not like the Buccaneers were the worst roster in football when they got there. Greg Schiano even hyped up their future after getting fired. Whoever takes this job over is taking over a good situation, a real good situation, is how Schiano described it. Light and the new regime had to make some tough decisions, including moving on from Darrelle Revis after 1 season and left tackle Donald Penn. Their top free agent signings of Anthony Collins, Michael Johnson, and Josh McCown all flopped, but their first draft pick of the new regime ended up being a future Hall of Famer, so they had that going for them. But while this team did not look too bad on paper, it didn't mean anything unless they can perform on Sundays. Their first 2 games of 2014 were tough losses. A 6-point loss in the opener against a bad Panthers team that somehow made the playoffs with 7 wins that year, and they lost to a Rams team that ended up with 6 wins. But weeks 3 and 4 for this team were fascinating. So they go on the road for the first time in week 3, and they lose to the Falcons by a score of 56-14. And it was bad. They were literally trailing 56-0 after 3 quarters. That outing by Atlanta ended up being the most points scored in the NFL in a game that season. But here's why I said the next 2 weeks were fascinating. So the Bucs were now off to an 0-3 start, coming off the most embarrassing loss you could imagine. But in week 4, they were now down to their quarterback 2, Mike Glennon, as Josh McCown was nursing a thumb injury. This team somehow went into Pittsburgh against the Killer Bees at the height of their powers and won the game. Vincent Jackson scored a game-winning touchdown with 7 seconds left to secure the first win for Lovie Smith as the Buccaneers head coach. Unfortunately for Tampa, they could not build on this big win, and they actually didn't win a game for almost another 2 months. They did secure their one and only convincing win of the season in a 27-7 blowout versus the Redskins, improving their record to 2-8. By this time, there was enough conviction about the top of the 2015 draft class, and it happened to include 2 high-end quarterback prospects. For Tampa, their quarterback position was a mess at this point. Mike Glennon, a former 3rd-round pick back in 2013, he was selected by the previous regime. He had his moments, but overall Tampa knew he was not going to be the long-term solution. Didn't mean that every team thought that way though. Josh McCown, who they signed on the heels of his impressive run filling in for Jay Cutler the year prior, he was now 35 and had some big turnover issues in Tampa. The only light at the end of the tunnel for this organization was drafting one of these high-end quarterbacks, and the one they were rumored to love was Florida State's Jameis Winston. Despite the win to improve to 2-8, Tampa was still tied for the worst record in the league with Tennessee. The problem was Tennessee was also going to be in the quarterback market. That wasn't their expectation coming into the year, but with Jake Locker soon to announce his retirement and no vote of confidence for Zach Mettenberger or Clipboard Jesus himself, we still had 6 weeks left of this epic tank-off, and neither team was willing to budge. Tennessee got close in week 15, surrendering their lead to the Jets in the final few minutes. Tampa, on the other hand, got really close to winning a couple games games against the Bengals and then the Panthers. Luckily for the Pro Tankers, they remained winless and entered the final week of the season tied with Tennessee for the worst record in football, based on strength of schedule, which in the event of a tie determines the draft order. And the Buccaneers and Titans were almost identical. But luckily for Tampa, based on how the rest of the schedule was played out, a loss in the final week of the season against the Saints would guarantee Tampa the first overall pick. On the bright side though, if Tampa were to in fact win this final game, the worst they could fall in the draft was to number 2 overall, which once again is not the worst thing in the world, with 2 quarterbacks expected to go 1 and 2. However, Jason Light and the Buccaneers, as mentioned earlier, were huge fans of Jameis Winston. So for Tampa's front office, securing the first overall pick was imperative. With that said though, the Buccaneers really did not hold out any starters for the final game of the season versus the Saints. The only starter of note who was inactive was linebacker Mason Foster, who was actually injured. Ironically, it was the Saints who had more talent sitting out, with left tackle Teron Armstead, safety Kenny Vaccaro, and defensive lineman Akeem Hicks. For the Saints, they unfortunately had nothing to play for. Their loss the prior week to the Falcons officially eliminated them from playoff contention, so technically the Saints front office could have sat everybody. But I think with the situation the way it was, and the Bucs at worst dropping to the number 2 overall pick, it didn't really give New Orleans incentive to hand their division rival a win to damage their draft pick. But I almost wonder if the circumstances were different, would they have done it? Let's say this was 3 years prior, and a prospect like Andrew Luck, who was described as can't miss, was sitting in this draft. It makes you wonder if the Saints would have actually sat their starters to guarantee their division rival to not get a franchise quarterback. But in this 2015 class, like many others, there was no quote-unquote sure thing sitting at the top. The way this Week 17 matchup went was pretty hilarious. It felt like you had a stadium full of Buccaneers fans who wanted their team to lose. Posters begging the team to lose were on display, and even some saying to draft Jameis Winston. But for those fans who desperately wanted to lose, it would not take long before their heart sank into their stomach. Early in the second quarter, the Bucs took a 10-0 lead on a Mike Evans touchdown. However, with the league's leading passer on the other side, this game was far from over. Breeze and the Saints were able to orchestrate a 12-play touchdown drive to make it 10-7, but McCown and the Bucs offense quickly responded once again. The Buccaneers found themselves up 20-7 at halftime, in a game where a majority of the fan base and probably the front office wanted to lose. Now here is where things got interesting. I've seen people joke before about a GM or an owner making a call down to a coach to sit starters to ensure their team loses, but this was no joke. It literally happened. Coming out of halftime, we saw very sketchy snap counts for some of the Buccaneers starters. Starting wide receivers Vincent Jackson and Mike Evans hardly saw the field in the second half, and Evans' quotes about not playing did not seem to make sense. Evans said, "They just pulled me because I was gassed. It was their decision." Backup wide receiver Tavares King and special teamer Russell Shepard played well over their usual snap rates, with Evans and V-Jax mysteriously sidelined. And to make it even funnier, Tavares King caused a critical interception with 5 minutes to go, and the Saints trailing by 6 points. Their starting running back Doug Martin touched the ball just twice in the fourth quarter and played less than 50% of the snaps overall. Their Pro Bowl guard Logan Mankins did not see the field for the final 19 offensive snaps. Star linebacker Levante David sat out the entire second half as well, which led to some more interesting quotes from the player himself. "There isn't anything to say. It was the coach's call to take guys out, and we just played with the cards we were dealt." One of their other starting linebackers, Danny Lansana, played a grand total of 13 snaps, yet the Buccaneers tried pinning that on Lansana for missing a team meeting. Was it true? I have no idea. After Keenan Lewis intercepted that pass off Tavares King's hands, the Saints were given a short field. On 3rd and 8, right at the 2-minute warning, trailing by 6, Breeze hit Marcus Colston on a perfect throw, to which Colston took the distance for a 36-yard touchdown. But still, the Buccaneers had one shot to win this game. They needed to get into field goal range with just under 2 minutes to go. A holding call on DeMar Dotson erased a 17-yard gain, and 3 plays later was the final nail in the coffin. Junior Gillette dusted this backup right tackle for the Bucs, and Josh McCown was sacked in the end zone for a safety. The Buccaneers entered this game 72-2 in regular season games when leading by at least 13 points to start the fourth quarter. After this loss, though, they made that 72-3. Although the organization could never admit to tanking, Lovie Smith did acknowledge that his best players were not on the the field at the end of the game. Yeah, we didn't have some of our best players in there at the end, but the guys we had in there, we felt like we could move the ball and be able to win. In the second half, we wanted to look at more football players. And sometimes it's not just the benching of players that will signify an obvious tank job, it's the way the game is called too. Josh McCown only had 3 pass attempts in the entire second half. And honestly, based on the tipped up interception, maybe they shouldn't have. Of course, you feel bad for the players, the coaches, and the small group of fans who prefer to winning this game, but whether it was ownership or Jason Light, their plan was executed to perfection. I mean, even the Saints coach at the time, Sean Payton, knew that his opponent was trying to lose the game on purpose. While I do wish this story had a happy ending, it didn't. Well, maybe, depending on how you look at it. The Bucs felt comfortable enough to draft Jameis Winston first overall, although Jason Light did admit he would have sided with Mariota had the off-field issues got in the way. But Jason Light had an obsession with Jameis Winston. He loved the way he carried himself and compared his demeanor and personality to Dan Marino and Tom Brady. While his first couple years in Tampa had real promise, the Jameis Winston experiment ultimately failed. He did give us the unforgettable 30-30 season, the only quarterback in history to do that, but that's how his Buccaneers tenure will mostly be remembered, sadly. But as I alluded to, this story had somewhat of a good ending, as the Buccaneers got their Super Bowl with Tom Brady the year after Jameis left. And now Jameis Winston is one of the more beloved players in the NFL. I don't think the Buccaneers regret what they did. After all, it's not like Marcus Mariota went on to have a Hall of Fame career in Tennessee. He may have won a playoff game, but still, that's about it. The Buccaneers front office identified their guy, and they did everything in their power to get him. And although it came close to not happening, they did get it done. And as a fan of a team myself who's missed out on some pretty high-end quarterbacks because they won some late season games that really had no meaning, I commend the Buccaneers for what they did. It's tough to execute because you know players and coaches don't want to tank, but as you can see from the example of this game, if your owner or GM feels a different way, they will get their way. And if Mike Evans and Levante David have to answer some awkward questions in the locker room after, then so be it. You still got the most important draft asset in the entire draft. That's going to do it for this video. Of course, leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I will talk to you guys next time.